Every year, I waited. Every year, I hoped. And every year, my parents forgot my birthday. For 2 decades, they didn't bother with a single cake, a single gift, or even a simple happy birthday. So when I finally had the chance to take the trip of a lifetime, I made a decision. I went alone. No invitations. No apologies. And when they found out, their reaction shocked me. Growing up, I learned quickly that my birthday was just another day. No balloons. No cake. No excited whispers in the morning telling me to check the kitchen table for presents. My parents weren't cruel. They weren't the type to shout or punish me unfairly. They fed me, clothed me, and made sure I had what I needed to get through life. But when it came to making me feel special, they failed. Over and over again. I noticed it for the first time when I was 5. A girl in my kindergarten class had a huge birthday party with a clown, a bounce house, and a table overflowing with gifts. I came home that day buzzing with excitement, asking my mom what my birthday party would be like. She had looked at me, eyes tired, and said, "Oh, honey, we'll do something nice." But when the day came, nothing. I sat at the dinner table, waiting, but my parents just talked about their day, their work, my older brother's soccer practice. It wasn't until I asked, "Did you get me a cake?" that they even realized what day it was. My dad chuckled, saying, "Oh wow, is it today? Sorry, kiddo. We'll do something later." Later never came. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe they'd remember next year. Maybe they'd feel bad. But year after year, it was the same. I'd wake up hopeful, thinking this would be the time they'd surprise me, but as the hours passed, that hope turned to disappointment. Every single time. I stayed up late some nights, staring at my bedroom door, willing them to suddenly remember and rush in with a cake, even if it was last minute. But the door never opened. They never remembered. By the time I turned 10, I stopped hoping. I still reminded them sometimes, just to test if it would change anything. "Hey, my birthday's coming up," I'd say, forcing a smile. They'd nod, distracted, and say something like, "Oh, we should do something." But when the day actually arrived, silence. No acknowledgement. No apology. They weren't mean about it. They just forgot. I watched my siblings get attention in ways I never did. My older brother was the golden child, the athlete, the one they always cheered for. My younger sister was the baby, the one who got fussed over. I was just there, the quiet middle child who didn't make waves. And when I did try to make waves, when I reminded them, when I asked for recognition, it never made a difference. One year, when I was 13, I decided I wouldn't say anything. No hints. No reminders. I wanted to see if they would remember on their own. The day came and went, and nothing happened. The next morning, I asked my mom what day it was. She told me the date without even flinching. I just nodded and walked away. She didn't even realize what she had missed. By the time I was 16, I had fully accepted it. I told myself birthdays weren't a big deal. I watched my friends celebrate theirs, I went to their parties, and I smiled through the pain when they asked, "What did your parents get you this year?" I started lying. "Oh, we just had a small dinner. They got me a gift card." It was easier than admitting the truth, that my birthday had been ignored yet again. One of the worst moments came when I was 18. I had just finished my last high school exam and was excited that my birthday was coming up that weekend. I casually mentioned it at dinner, and my dad nodded. "Oh, that's right. We should do something," my mom added. "Maybe we'll get takeout." That was it. No plans, no excitement. Just a vague maybe for takeout. And when the day actually came, they forgot. Again. That night, I sat in my room with a cupcake I had bought for myself at a gas station. I didn't even put a candle on it. I just stared at it, feeling numb. I wasn't even sad anymore. Just exhausted. The final straw was my 21st birthday. A milestone. The kind of birthday people always remember. My friends had talked about throwing a party, but I kept telling them, "No, I think my family might actually do something this year." After all, they had to remember this one, right? That evening, I walked into the kitchen, where my parents were casually discussing my brother's upcoming graduation party. They were planning the menu, talking about decorations. Meanwhile, my birthday, the biggest milestone of my life so far, wasn't even on their radar. I waited for them to notice. I sat at the table, hoping someone would say something. When they didn't, I finally broke. "Hey, you know today's my birthday, right?" My mom froze, her eyes going wide. She glanced at my dad, and for the first time, I saw something that almost looked like guilt. "Oh," she said after a beat. "Really? Sorry, honey. We've been so busy." Then she went right back to planning my brother's party. That was the moment I knew. They were never going to change. By the time I turned 18, I had fully accepted that my birthday was nothing more than an ordinary day in my family's eyes, another date on the calendar that held no real significance to them. I no longer waited with excitement, no longer held on to some naive hope that they would suddenly remember and make me feel special. That year, I spent my birthday exactly how I had expected to, alone in my room, with a gas station cupcake that I had bought for myself because I knew nobody else would. I didn't even put a candle on it, didn't bother making a wish, because what was the point when I already knew how the day would end? I wasn't sad anymore, not like I had been in the past, when I used to stare at the door expecting it to burst open with some last-minute surprise. No, this time was different. This time, I was just numb. I went through the motions of my birthday without so much as a mention from my parents, who went about their day as if it were any other. It didn't matter that I had reminded them a week before, didn't matter that I had deliberately dropped hints in conversations, didn't matter that I had even written the date on the family calendar in bold red ink. If they had seen it, they had chosen to ignore it. That night, I listened to them talk about work, about my siblings, about errands they needed to run the next day, about everything except me. I had given up on them ever caring, and as I sat in my room, staring at the tiny cupcake with its plastic container fogged up from the cold, I felt something settle inside me, something final, something irreversible. But the real breaking point came 3 years later, on my 21st birthday, a milestone that most people spent celebrating with family, friends, and excitement. It was supposed to be one of those birthdays that mattered, one of those birthdays that nobody could possibly forget because it was significant. Turning 21 wasn't just about the number. It was about stepping into adulthood, about marking a new chapter in life, about finally being recognized as someone worth celebrating. My friends were excited for me, making plans to take me out, to buy me my first legal drink, to do something memorable. But my parents didn't say a single word. That evening, as I walked into the kitchen, they were casually sitting at the table, deep in discussion about my brother's upcoming graduation party. They were planning the food, talking about decorations, making a list of guests to invite, throwing around ideas about venues. Meanwhile, I stood there, waiting, watching, wondering if they even knew what day it was, if it would finally click that today was supposed to be about me. I thought, maybe, if I lingered long enough, if I gave them a chance, one of them would suddenly remember, their eyes would widen, and they would say, "Oh my God, we forgot. Happy birthday." But the conversation continued, completely uninterrupted by my presence, completely focused on my brother's event, as if nothing else in the world mattered. I sat down at the table, hoping that my presence alone would remind them, hoping that if I made myself visible, they would take notice and say something. But they didn't. They laughed about party themes, debated catering options, talked about sending invitations. And the longer I sat there, the harder it became to swallow the lump forming in my throat, the harder it became to pretend that this didn't bother me when, deep down, it was clawing at me like an open wound that refused to heal. I had told myself I didn't care anymore, had convinced myself that I was immune to disappointment, but this was different. I waited for them to realize, waited for something, but they just kept talking, completely unaware of the storm building inside me. And then, before I could stop myself, I finally blurted out, "Hey, you know today's my birthday, right?" My voice was steady, but my heart was racing, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to hope, just a little, that maybe, just maybe, this would be the moment they realized how much they had been ignoring me. They froze for a second, looking at each other like they were trying to process my words, like I had just spoken in another language. My mom blinked, then tilted her head. "Oh, really?" she said, her voice laced with mild surprise, as if she had just remembered she had forgotten to pick up milk from the grocery store. "Sorry, honey, we've been so busy." Then, just like that, they went right back to talking about my brother's party. I didn't hear what they said after that. The words blurred together into background noise, their voices fading into something distant and meaningless. I sat there, staring at them, waiting for one of them to realize how much they had just hurt me, waiting for one of them to say, "Wait, let's stop for a second. This is important." But they didn't. The realization settled over me like a thick, suffocating weight, pressing into my chest, making it hard to breathe. They were never going to change. They had done this for 21 years, and nothing was going to make them start caring now. I pushed my chair back, standing up so abruptly that the legs scraped against the floor. They barely noticed. I walked to my room without another word, my fingers gripping the doorknob so tightly that my knuckles turned white. And when I finally shut the door behind me, I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding, staring at the wall as my mind replayed the moment over and over again. This wasn't just about my birthday. This was about me. This was about the way I had always been an afterthought, the way my needs, my feelings, my existence had always been something secondary, something optional. And no matter how much I had tried to make peace with it, no matter how many times I had told myself that I was used to it, that I didn't care, this moment proved that I did. And that was the moment I knew. I was done waiting for them to see me. I didn't get angry that night, didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't let them see even a fraction of the hurt they had caused me after forgetting yet another birthday. I sat in my room, staring at the ceiling, letting the realization sink in fully, accepting once and for all that my parents were never going to change, never going to suddenly remember, never going to wake up and regret all the birthdays they had ignored. If they had felt any guilt, any remorse, they would have done something, said something, shown me in some way that I mattered. But they hadn't, and they never would. And so, instead of breaking down, instead of allowing myself to feel that same old pain, I made a decision that night, a decision that would shape the next few years of my life. If my parents weren't going to celebrate me, then I would do it myself, and I would do it in a way that they would never forget. I wasn't just going to buy myself a small cake or treat myself to a nice dinner or do something simple that barely made up for the years of neglect. No, I was going to do it right, in the biggest, most extravagant, most unforgettable way possible. I wasn't looking for revenge, not exactly, but I was determined to prove something to myself, to show myself that I was worth celebrating, even if the people who were supposed to love me the most never made the effort to do so. Over the next few years, I threw myself into work, picking up extra shifts, saving every spare dollar, cutting out unnecessary expenses, focusing on one single goal, giving myself the kind of birthday celebration that would make up for every single one that had been ignored. I researched the most luxurious destinations, read reviews of 5-star resorts, compared first-class airline tickets, and planned out every single detail of what would be the most incredible trip of my life. This wasn't just about a vacation, wasn't just about a getaway. It was about rewriting the narrative of my birthdays, about creating a moment so spectacular that it would erase all the painful memories of sitting alone in my room, waiting for people who never showed up for me. By the time my 25th birthday approached, I had everything booked, everything meticulously planned down to the smallest detail. I wasn't just taking a trip, I was disappearing for a week, vanishing into a world of luxury where I could pretend, just for a little while, that I had always been celebrated, that I had never once been forgotten. I had reserved an oceanfront suite at one of the most exclusive island resorts, complete with private butler service, spa treatments, and the kind of extravagant amenities that my younger self would have never even dreamed of experiencing. I had first-class flights booked, planned excursions, gourmet dining experiences, and not a single moment of that trip was going to be wasted. And this time, I didn't say a word to my parents. No reminders. No hints. Nothing at all. I had spent 24 years giving them chances to remember, to care, to make even the smallest effort, and I was done waiting for them to notice me. They had proven time and time again that my birthday meant nothing to them, so I decided that this time, they wouldn't get the chance to ignore it. Instead of giving them another opportunity to forget, I simply removed them from the equation entirely. The morning of my trip, I packed my bags in complete silence, my heart pounding with anticipation, a strange mix of excitement and defiance filling my chest as I double-checked my passport, my confirmation emails, my itinerary. It was the first time in my life that I wasn't dreading my birthday, the first time I wasn't bracing myself for disappointment, the first time I was actually looking forward to celebrating myself. And as I locked the door behind me and made my way to the airport, I felt something shift deep inside me, something that told me that this was only the beginning of a completely new chapter in my life. I arrived at the airport early, checked in for my first-class flight, and settled into the luxury lounge, sipping on a perfectly made cappuccino as I watched people rush past, oblivious to the fact that I was about to embark on the most important journey of my life. When I finally boarded the plane and sank into my plush seat, I took a deep breath, letting the reality of it all sink in. This was my moment. This was my celebration. No one else's. As the plane took off, I pulled out my phone, snapped a quick photo of my boarding pass alongside a perfectly chilled glass of champagne, and posted it to my social media without a caption, just letting the image speak for itself. I wasn't doing it for attention, wasn't looking for validation, but part of me wanted them to see it, wanted them to wonder where I was, wanted them to feel even a fraction of the confusion and disbelief I had felt every single year when they had forgotten my existence. It didn't take long for the messages to start coming in. First, my mom, "Where are you going?" Then my dad, "Are you on vacation?" And then, the message that made my breath catch in my throat, The message that felt like the final, undeniable proof that I had been right about them all along. Wait, is today your birthday? For a long moment, I just stared at the screen, reading those words over and over again, feeling something inside me harden, something cold and final settling in my chest. It had been 25 years. 25 chances. And the only reason they even thought to ask was because they saw me doing something without them. I locked my phone, leaned back in my seat, and let out a slow breath, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over me. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even hurt. I just knew, with absolute certainty, that I had made the right decision. They could wonder. They could feel guilty. They could ask their meaningless questions. But this time, I wasn't going to give them an answer. This time, my birthday belonged to me. The morning of my trip, I woke up with a feeling that was completely unfamiliar to me on my birthday. Pure, unfiltered excitement. There was no dread, no sinking feeling in my stomach, no waiting for the inevitable disappointment that always came when my parents failed to acknowledge the day. For the first time in my entire life, I wasn't bracing myself for the sting of being forgotten. Instead, I was looking forward to something that was entirely for me. I had spent years feeling invisible, years convincing myself that birthdays didn't matter, years trying to suppress the longing for a celebration that would never come. But now, as I zipped up my suitcase and checked my passport one last time, I realized that I was about to experience what it felt like to be celebrated, even if I was the only one doing the celebrating. The car ride to the airport was smooth, the usual chaos of morning traffic barely registering in my mind as I stared out the window, already imagining the moment I would step onto the white sand beaches, feel the warmth of the sun on my skin, and sip on cocktails without a single obligation or responsibility weighing me down. As soon as I arrived, I checked in at the first-class counter, feeling a quiet sense of pride as the attendant handed me my boarding pass with a polite smile. This was something I had earned, something I had worked toward for years, something that belonged to me alone. After breezing through security, I made my way to the airport lounge, settling into a plush chair with a perfectly made cappuccino in one hand and my phone in the other. I had planned to keep this trip entirely to myself, to disappear for a week without a word to my parents, without giving them the opportunity to pretend they cared after the fact. But as I sat there, scrolling through my messages, I had an impulse, a small, fleeting thought that maybe, just maybe, they would notice if I posted something. Not for their sake, but for mine. Not because I needed their validation, but because I wanted them to see what it looked like when I stopped waiting for them to care. So, without thinking too much about it, I snapped a quick photo of my boarding pass sitting next to my freshly poured drink, the condensation already forming on the glass. No caption, no explanation, just a simple, silent statement that I was going somewhere, that I was doing something special, that I was no longer sitting in my bedroom pretending not to care that they had forgotten me again. I hit post, placed my phone face down on the table, and took a deep breath, letting the quiet hum of the lounge settle around me. It took less than an hour for my phone to start buzzing. At first, I ignored it, assuming it was the usual flood of birthday messages from friends who did remember, from the people who had made an effort every year even when my own family had failed. But when I finally picked up my phone and glanced at the screen, I saw a series of unread texts, not from my friends, but from my parents. The first message was from my mom, short and direct. "Where are you going?" Then my dad, "Are you on vacation?" And then, the message that made me pause, the message that made my heart race. Not with sadness, not with anger, but with something closer to dark amusement. "Wait, is today your birthday?" I stared at the words for a long moment, reading them over and over again, letting the weight of them settle in my chest. 25 years. That was how long it had taken for them to notice. Not because they suddenly remembered on their own, not because they had been marking the date on a calendar or planning something special in secret, but because they had seen me celebrating without them. The only reason they had realized was because they were witnessing it happen in real time, because for once, I wasn't sitting around waiting for them to remember. I was already gone. I let out a small laugh, shaking my head as I set my phone back down, ignoring the buzzing that followed as more messages came through. I knew what was coming next, attempts to justify, attempts to excuse, attempts to shift the blame back onto me as if I was the one who had failed them by not reminding them this year. But I didn't care. Not anymore. Because in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that I had made the right decision. As my flight was called for boarding, I stood up, grabbed my things, and walked toward the gate without a second thought, without a single ounce of hesitation. I wasn't going to reply, wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of an explanation. Let them wonder. Let them sit with it. Let them finally feel what it was like to be the ones left out, the ones forgotten, the ones staring at their phones wondering why I hadn't included them. When I settled into my first class seat, the flight attendant came by with a warm smile, offering me a glass of champagne before takeoff. I accepted it, lifting the glass slightly in silent celebration, in acknowledgement of the fact that I had finally stopped waiting for people who had never bothered to wait for me. As the plane taxied down the runway, I glanced at my phone one last time, seeing more messages from my mom, my dad, even my sister now, all of them suddenly so concerned about where I was, about what I was doing, about why I hadn't told them. But instead of responding, instead of explaining, I simply turned off my phone, leaned back in my seat, and smiled to myself as the plane lifted off the ground. For the first time in 25 years, my birthday belonged to me. I ignored their texts at first, not out of anger or resentment, but simply because I had no interest in letting them interrupt the peace I had finally created for myself. For the first time in my entire life, I was spending my birthday exactly the way I wanted, without waiting for anyone else to make me feel seen, without hoping that maybe this year would be the year my parents finally remembered on their own. As I stepped into my luxury ocean view suite, taking in the breathtaking sight of endless blue water stretching out before me, I let out a deep breath I hadn't even realized I was holding. There was something incredibly freeing about knowing that this moment belonged only to me, that this experience wasn't tainted by disappointment, that I was here because I had chosen to be. After setting my bags down, I immediately called for room service, ordering a meal that felt indulgent and extravagant, the kind of thing I would have never treated myself to in the past. As I waited, I stepped onto my private balcony, letting the warm island breeze wash over my skin, feeling the tension in my body slowly melt away with every breath. For the first time in 25 years, I wasn't spending my birthday pretending not to care, wasn't sitting alone in my room waiting for people to remember me. Instead, I was standing in paradise, watching the waves roll onto the shore, completely at peace with the fact that I was finally celebrating myself. By the time I checked my phone again, the number of unread messages had tripled, the screen filled with missed calls, texts, and even a few voicemails that I had absolutely no intention of listening to. My mom's messages had shifted from confusion to something else entirely, something that almost made me laugh. "We didn't forget on purpose. We've just been busy," she had written, as if the excuse made any difference, as if being too busy to acknowledge my existence for 25 years somehow made it better. My dad had chimed in shortly after, his message reading, "You could have told us you were planning something. We would have joined you." That last message actually made me laugh out loud, the sheer irony of it almost too much to believe. After all the years of being ignored, after all the birthdays they had let pass by without so much as a single phone call, now they suddenly wanted to be included? Now, when I was finally doing something for myself, when I was finally experiencing the kind of celebration I had longed for since childhood, now they wanted to be part of it. It was almost comical how predictable it was, how their sudden interest had nothing to do with actually caring about me and everything to do with the fact that they were no longer in control of the narrative. I scrolled through more of the messages, my expression unreadable as I took in the increasingly desperate tone of my mother's texts. "You should have told us you were leaving," one read, as if I owed them an itinerary, as if they had ever once cared about my plans before. "We would have done something for you," another one insisted, which only made me shake my head in disbelief. If they really would have done something, why hadn't they done it any of the previous years? Why had I spent every birthday of my childhood waiting for a celebration that never came? The answer was painfully obvious. They weren't upset that they had forgotten. They were upset that I had finally stopped waiting for them. I placed my phone down on the table beside me, unwilling to let their sudden regret pull me back into the cycle of disappointment that I had spent so many years trapped in. I had given them chance after chance, year after year, hoping for something that was never going to happen, and now that I had finally taken control of my own happiness, they wanted to guilt me for it? No, I wasn't going to let them ruin this for me. Not now, not ever again. That night, as I sat on the balcony with a glass of wine, listening to the sound of the waves crashing against the shore, I felt something inside me shift, something final settle into place. This trip wasn't just a vacation. It was proof that I didn't need their approval, proof that I could create my own joy, proof that their absence from my life didn't have to feel like a loss. They had spent 25 years making me feel like I didn't matter, and now, for the first time, I truly didn't care if I mattered to them or not. I let my phone buzz on the table, ignored the repeated calls, watched as the messages kept pouring in, each one growing more insistent, more desperate, more pathetic. My mother's tone had shifted from guilt to frustration, her messages no longer apologies, but demands for answers. "Why aren't you responding? This isn't like you," one read, and that was the moment I realized she was right. This wasn't like me. The old me, the one who had spent years begging for scraps of attention, would have answered, would have reassured them, would have folded under the weight of their words. But that version of me didn't exist anymore. For years, I had been invisible to them, a forgotten afterthought in their busy lives, an extra piece in a family that never quite made space for me. But now I was the one making them feel forgotten, and for the first time in my life, I realized how much power there was in that. They could feel guilty, they could feel confused, they could feel regret, but none of that was my responsibility. I wasn't going to let their sudden interest change anything, wasn't going to let them pretend that years of neglect could be erased with a few hastily typed messages. As the night stretched on and the island lights flickered against the water, I turned my phone off completely, silencing the noise of their regret, blocking out the voices that had never spoken up for me when it actually mattered. I wasn't going to spend another second of my birthday explaining myself to people who had never once tried to understand me, wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of a response that would allow them to pretend they had done nothing wrong. For the first time ever, I was putting myself first. And for the first time ever, they were the ones being ignored. That night, as I stood on my private balcony overlooking the darkened ocean, I felt the weight of my decisions settling deep in my chest, not in a way that made me doubt myself, but in a way that made me realize just how much I had finally broken free. The air was warm and thick with the scent of salt. The sound of waves crashing in the distance a steady, soothing reminder that I was somewhere else, somewhere far removed from the life I had always known, somewhere that had nothing to do with the people who had spent years making me feel like an afterthought. I had turned my phone off earlier in the evening, letting the silence wash over me, but eventually curiosity got the better of me, and I powered it back on, not because I wanted to talk to them, but because I wanted to see just how much my absence had shaken them. The second the screen lit up, I saw the missed calls, more than a dozen from my mom, a handful from my dad, even a few from my younger sister, whose name I hadn't expected to appear. The text messages had piled up as well, shifting from confusion to guilt, from guilt to frustration, and then from frustration to outright panic. My mother's most recent message stood out the most, a simple but weighted sentence that made me pause. "Please answer." Just once. I stared at the words for a long time, debating whether I should continue to ignore them or if, for the first time in my life, I should make them sit in the silence the way I had for years. But something in me wanted to hear what she had to say, wanted to know if she had finally realized how much damage had been done. So when my phone rang again, her name flashing across the screen, I hesitated only for a second before pressing accept, lifting the device to my ear with a steady, unreadable expression. The moment I answered, she didn't speak right away, and for a brief, fleeting second, I thought she might have regretted calling, that maybe she had expected me to ignore her completely. But then, when she finally did speak, her voice was different, soft, uncertain, missing the usual edge of exasperation she had whenever she spoke to me. "We didn't mean to forget," she said quietly, the words slow and deliberate, like she knew how pathetic they sounded but had decided to say them anyway. "We just assumed you didn't care about birthdays." I let out a breath, gripping the edge of the railing in front of me, my knuckles tightening around the cool metal as I let her words sink in. I could hear the guilt in her voice, could feel the weight of her realization even through the distance between us, but it wasn't enough, not after 25 years of being ignored, of being overlooked, of being the one person in the family whose existence seemed entirely optional. I closed my eyes for a brief moment before responding, my voice steady but laced with something sharp, something that had been building inside me for years. "I stopped caring," I said, each word precise, "because you never did." There was silence on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that spoke louder than any excuse ever could, the kind of silence that told me she was finally processing what I had known all along. I didn't rush to fill the void, didn't try to soften the blow of my words, because for once I wanted her to sit in it, to feel what it was like to be the one left out, to understand just a fraction of what it meant to be forgotten over and over again. And then, after what felt like forever, she whispered something I had never expected to hear from her, something that sent a strange, unfamiliar ache through my chest. "I'm sorry." I didn't respond right away, letting the words hang between us, wondering if she even understood the full weight of what she had just said. An apology didn't erase 25 years of birthdays spent alone, Didn't undo the nights I had spent staring at my bedroom door waiting for someone to remember me. Didn't change the fact that I'd spent my entire life convincing myself that I wasn't worth celebrating. But at the same time, hearing her say it, hearing her acknowledge even a sliver of the pain she had caused, made something inside me shift. I didn't forgive her, not immediately, but I did hear her, and for now, that was enough. You should be, I finally said, my voice quieter now, less anger, more exhaustion. I wasn't trying to be cruel, wasn't trying to hurt her, but I also wasn't going to pretend that an apology could fix everything, wasn't going to let her believe that this was something that could be undone with a single phone call. Do you even understand what it felt like? I asked, my voice steady, the rawness of my emotions pressing against my ribs like a weight I had been carrying for far too long. Do you even realize how many times I sat there, waiting for you to see me, waiting for one of you to care enough to remember? She let out a shaky breath, and for a moment, I thought she might not answer, that she might do what she always did, brush it off, redirect, make excuses that place the blame anywhere but on herself. But then, in a voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it, she admitted the truth. I think I do now. It wasn't a grand revelation, wasn't a dramatic, tearful moment where she suddenly begged for my forgiveness, but it was something, more than I had ever expected from her. And for the first time in my life, I thought that maybe, just maybe, she was actually listening. But listening wasn't the same as fixing, and an apology wasn't the same as change, and I wasn't going to let myself believe that this conversation was enough to heal the years of damage that had already been done. After a long pause, she cleared her throat and hesitated before speaking again. When you come home, maybe we can do something for your birthday. A late celebration. The words felt foreign, like she wasn't even sure she should be saying them, like she was testing the waters, trying to gauge if there was any chance of repairing what had already been broken. I thought about it for a moment, thought about what it would mean to accept, what it would mean to go back, what it would mean to sit at a table with them and pretend that things were normal. And then, as I looked out at the vast ocean stretching endlessly before me, I realized that I didn't need their celebration anymore, didn't need their validation, didn't need them to make up for what they had already lost. I'll think about it, I said, my voice careful, my words not a promise but not a rejection either. And for the first time, I meant it. For the first time in my entire life, my mother admitted that they had messed up, that they had failed me in ways that went beyond just forgetting a single day each year. She didn't try to shift the blame onto me, didn't claim that I'd been too quiet about my feelings, didn't make excuses about how busy life had been or how hard parenting was. She simply let the words hang between us, an admission of guilt that carried more weight than anything she had ever said before. And that caught me completely off guard, because for as long as I could remember, my parents had always justified, always rationalized, always found a way to downplay the hurt they had caused. There was something about hearing my mother actually acknowledge her failure, something about the way her voice trembled slightly as she admitted she had finally begun to understand, that made me pause longer than I expected. I wasn't sure if it was the truth or if it was just guilt manifesting in a way that made her feel better about herself, but either way, it didn't change the reality of what had already happened. Years of birthdays had passed in silence, years of me sitting alone, hoping they would remember, waiting for a gesture that never came, convincing myself over and over again that maybe I was the problem, that maybe I was expecting too much. Now, standing on my private balcony, the wind warm against my skin and the sound of the waves crashing in the distance, I realized something I had never considered before. This wasn't about them anymore, and maybe it never really had been. She hesitated before speaking again, her voice softer now, almost uncertain, like she knew she was walking on fragile ground. When you come back, maybe we could do something, like a make-up birthday celebration, she said, the words carefully chosen, her tone cautious, as if she wasn't entirely sure how I would respond. I could hear it in her voice, the hope, the quiet desperation, the unspoken plea for a second chance, for an opportunity to do what they should have done years ago. But the difference now was that I didn't need it anymore, didn't want it in the way I once had, didn't feel that ache in my chest that had always been there when I thought about what I had missed out on. This trip wasn't about making them feel guilty, wasn't about proving a point, wasn't about forcing them to see what they had lost. It was about finally putting myself first after a lifetime of being an afterthought. I let the silence stretch between us for a moment, letting her sit in the discomfort, letting her feel the weight of the choice I was about to make. Because for the first time, I was the one in control of this conversation. I was the one deciding what happened next. I was the one who finally had the power to dictate how this relationship moved forward. And maybe that was what unsettled her the most, The fact that for the first time in my life, I wasn't grasping for scraps of their attention, wasn't begging for recognition, wasn't waiting for them to choose me. So I told her, in a voice that was calm but firm, "I'll think about it." And for once, I actually meant it, not as an attempt to avoid confrontation, not as a way to placate her guilt, but as a genuine statement of truth. I would think about it, but only on my terms, only if it felt right for me, only if I decided that their presence in my life was something that added to it rather than something that continued to take from me. She didn't push, didn't argue, didn't try to convince me, and I think that was the biggest surprise of all. Instead, she simply said, "Okay," her voice quiet, resigned, as if she knew that there was nothing she could say that would undo what had already been done. And maybe, for the first time, she truly understood that an apology wasn't a magic eraser, wasn't a reset button, wasn't something that could suddenly wipe away the years of neglect and indifference. After we hung up, I stood there for a long time, staring out at the vast expanse of ocean in front of me, watching the way the moonlight shimmered across the waves, feeling this strange mix of emotions swirling inside me. A part of me had expected to feel relief, had expected that hearing my mother finally admit what I had known all along would bring some sense of closure, but instead, all I felt was clarity. Because now, for the first time in my life, I wasn't looking for their approval, wasn't waiting for their validation, wasn't hoping that they would finally become the parents I had always needed them to be. I was simply standing in my own power, making choices that were mine and mine alone. For years, I had convinced myself that if they just realized what they had done, if they just saw how much they had hurt me, if they just acknowledged the pain they had caused, then somehow everything would fall into place. But the truth was, their acknowledgement didn't change the past, didn't rewrite the years of loneliness, didn't erase the moments where I had felt invisible in my own home. The only thing that had changed was me, the only thing that had shifted was my willingness to accept that I no longer needed anything from them. That night, I slept better than I had in years, not because my mother had apologized, not because she had finally admitted what I had always known, but because I knew that I had taken control of my own story. This birthday was mine, this life was mine, and for the first time, I wasn't waiting for anyone else to make it feel like it mattered. I spent the rest of my vacation exactly as I had planned, indulging in every luxury, embracing every moment, and finally experiencing what it felt like to be celebrated without waiting for someone else to make me feel worthy of attention. Each morning, I woke up to the soft sound of waves crashing outside my balcony, stretching out beneath the warmth of the sun, knowing that for the first time, I wasn't waking up dreading the possibility of being forgotten. I booked spa treatments that left my skin glowing and my body relaxed, treating myself to massages, facials, and long soaks in infinity pools that overlooked the endless blue horizon. I dined at restaurants where the waitstaff treated me like royalty, savoring gourmet meals paired with expensive wine, enjoying the luxury of knowing that every bite, every sip, every single moment was mine alone. On the third day, I went snorkeling in crystal-clear waters, letting the gentle sway of the ocean carry me, marveling at the vibrant colors of the fish and coral beneath me. I had never done anything like this before, had never taken the time to experience something purely for the joy of it, had never allowed myself to live fully without the nagging thought that I was supposed to be waiting for someone else to acknowledge me first. But here, in this place where no one knew my story, where no one saw me as the girl whose birthdays had always been ignored, I was finally just me. No longer an afterthought, no longer invisible, no longer hoping for someone to give me permission to exist. Each evening, I sat on my private balcony, sipping a perfectly mixed cocktail as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in breathtaking shades of pink and gold. I let the warmth settle into my skin, let the satisfaction of knowing that I had created this experience for myself wash over me. This wasn't about proving a point, wasn't about punishing my parents, wasn't about making them feel guilty for the years of neglect. I had already let go of that need. This was about reclaiming something they had never given me, about making up for lost time in a way that didn't rely on them. And when I finally packed my bags and prepared to return home, I knew that I was walking away from this trip as a different person, someone who no longer needed their approval, someone who had finally learned what it meant to celebrate herself. When I got home, I made a decision, one that surprised even me. I agreed to dinner with my parents, but only under one condition. This time, it had to be about me. No last-minute planning. No distractions. No rushing through a meal while they talked about my siblings' accomplishments or their own busy schedules. I told them clearly, with no room for negotiation, that if they wanted me to show up, it had to be intentional, it had to be meaningful, and it had to be a genuine effort, not just some half-hearted attempt to ease their guilt. And, to my surprise, they agreed. I didn't know if they truly understood the significance of my request, didn't know if they were doing this because they finally realized how much they had hurt me, or if they were just afraid of losing me altogether. But for once, it didn't matter because this time, I was the one setting the terms. I wasn't going to beg them to care, wasn't going to remind them to celebrate me, wasn't going to lower my expectations just to make it easier for them. If they wanted to be part of my life moving forward, they had to show up, and they had to do it right. The night of the dinner, I arrived at the restaurant a few minutes early, choosing a table near the window where I could watch the city lights flicker against the evening sky. I had dressed up for the occasion, not for them, but for me, wearing something that made me feel powerful, confident, completely in control. When my parents arrived, I saw the hesitation in their faces, the way my mother fidgeted with her purse strap, the way my father glanced around as if unsure of how to start. It was strange, seeing them be the ones who felt awkward, seeing them be the ones trying to find the right words, seeing them be the ones who had to put in the effort for once. "Happy birthday," my mom said first, her voice careful, like she was testing the weight of the words, unsure if they still held meaning after all these years. I nodded, giving her a small smile, but I didn't rush to fill the silence, didn't let them off the hook with easy conversation. I wanted to see if they would truly make the effort, if they would ask me about my life, if they would take this moment seriously instead of letting it pass by as just another casual meal. To my surprise, they did. They asked me about my trip, actually listened when I talked about the places I had seen, the experiences I had had, the way it felt to finally do something for myself. They didn't interrupt, didn't change the subject to my siblings, didn't brush off my words with empty nods and distracted glances at their phones. For the first time, they were fully present, and though I knew it didn't erase the years of being forgotten, it was something. When dessert arrived, my mom hesitated before reaching into her bag, pulling out a small wrapped box and sliding it across the table toward me. "I know this doesn't make up for everything," she said quietly, her eyes searching mine, "but I wanted you to have something, even if it's late." I stared at the box for a moment, surprised by the gesture, by the uncertainty in her voice, by the way my father looked at me with something that almost resembled regret. I wasn't sure if they would ever fully understand how much their actions had shaped me, wasn't sure if this was the start of real change or just a temporary effort to ease their guilt. But as I reached for the box and carefully unwrapped it, I realized that it didn't matter. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for them to make things right. I had already done that for myself. That night, as I drove home, I felt lighter than I had in years, not because my parents had suddenly become perfect, not because they had fixed everything with one dinner and one small gift, but because I knew that no matter what happened next, I would never go back to being that girl who waited in silence for people to remember her. I had finally learned to celebrate myself, and that was something no one could ever take away from me. For the first time in my entire life, my parents actually put effort into my birthday, something I had stopped believing would ever happen, something that felt both foreign and strangely overdue. It wasn't extravagant, wasn't some grand event meant to make up for all the years of neglect, but it was something, and for them, that was already more than I had ever expected. They made reservations at a restaurant, not just a last-minute decision based on convenience, but an actual plan that had been set in advance, something that required thought, something that meant they had considered me for once. When I arrived, they were already there waiting, a small cake sitting on the table with my name written across the top, a sight so unfamiliar to me that I had to take a moment to process it, to remind myself that this was actually happening. They greeted me with hesitant smiles, the kind that carried both warmth and unspoken guilt, as if they knew how late this effort had come, as if they understood that no matter how much they tried now, they could never truly undo the past. My mother pulled out a small envelope and slid it across the table toward me, and when I opened it, I found a handwritten note, something I had never received from her before, something that felt more significant than any gift could have. In her neat, careful handwriting, she had written, "I'm sorry for all the years we missed. I don't expect this to fix everything, but I hope it's a start." I stared at the words for a long time, feeling something shift inside me, something that wasn't anger, something that wasn't resentment, something closer to quiet understanding. Dinner itself was pleasant, and for once, the conversation didn't revolve around my siblings, didn't drift into topics that made me feel like I was invisible, didn't leave me sitting in silence while they discussed things that had nothing to do with me. They asked about my life, about my work, about my trip, actually listening when I spoke, actually engaging instead of just nodding absent-mindedly. My father, usually reserved, made an effort to contribute to the conversation, making small comments that showed he had been paying attention, that he had actually thought about what I had said the last time we spoke. My mother, who had spent so many years dismissing my feelings, actually looked at me with something that resembled regret, something that made me think that maybe, just maybe, she was finally starting to understand. When the waiter brought out the cake, my mother lit the candle herself, something so simple yet so profound, something that felt like a quiet apology wrapped in a single flickering flame. She didn't rush me, didn't brush past the moment like it was an obligation, didn't let it be overshadowed by distractions. She simply smiled and said, "Make a wish," and for the first time in my life, I actually took a moment to do it, not because I needed the wish to come true, but because it felt like I was finally reclaiming something that had been missing for so long. I appreciated the effort, truly, but as I sat there watching them try, watching them navigate this unfamiliar territory of showing up for me, I also knew something incredibly important. I didn't need it anymore. The longing that had once consumed me, the desperate hope that they would one day wake up and realize what they had done, the quiet pain that had settled in my chest every year as I waited for a celebration that never came, all of it had faded into something else, something lighter, something that no longer had control over me. I wasn't bitter, wasn't angry, wasn't sitting there tallying up all the years they had failed me, because for the first time, I didn't need them to fix it. I had already done that for myself. This dinner, this cake, this effort, they were nice, but they weren't necessary for me to feel whole, weren't required for me to believe that I was worth celebrating. I had already learned to do that on my own, had already given myself the love and recognition they had failed to provide, had already built a life where my happiness wasn't dependent on whether or not they remembered me. As I blew out the candle, I realized that the person sitting at this table wasn't the same person who had spent years waiting in the shadows, hoping for scraps of attention, convincing herself that if she just held on a little longer, they would finally see her. That girl was gone, replaced by someone who knew her worth, someone who didn't need validation, someone who had created her own joy. And for the first time, I was completely at peace with that. That trip changed something deep inside me in a way I never could have imagined. Something that went beyond the luxury, beyond the breathtaking views, beyond the indulgence of treating myself to an experience I had always dreamed of. It wasn't just about taking a vacation or proving a point to my parents or even making up for all the years I had been ignored. It was about realizing that I'd spent far too long waiting for other people to give me permission to feel special, to feel worthy, to feel seen. For so many years, I had told myself that birthdays didn't really matter, that being forgotten wasn't a big deal, that I was strong enough to handle the disappointment. But sitting on that beach, staring out at the endless ocean, I finally admitted the truth to myself. It had always mattered. It had always hurt. And I had spent my entire life shrinking that pain down, tucking it away, pretending it didn't exist because I thought it was easier than confronting the fact that the people who were supposed to care the most had never really tried at all. But this time, I had taken matters into my own hands, had rewritten the story of what my birthday could be, had proven to myself that I was worth celebrating, even if I was the only one who did it. That realization was something no one could ever take away from me, something that changed the way I saw myself, something that made me understand that I didn't need anyone's validation to make my own moments meaningful. For the first time, I understood what it meant to truly celebrate myself, not out of necessity, not as a backup plan, not as a way to fill the emptiness left behind by my parents' neglect, but because I genuinely deserved to. That trip wasn't just about luxury. It was about reclaiming something I had been denied for years. So now, every year I take a trip, sometimes solo, sometimes with friends, but always on my own terms, always in a way that feels fulfilling, always in a way that reminds me that my happiness is in my own hands. I don't wait for someone to remember. Don't hold my breath hoping for a last-minute phone call. Don't sit around wondering if my parents have finally learned to acknowledge the day without being reminded. If they remember, that's fine, and if they don't, it doesn't matter, because I have finally learned the most important lesson of all. I will never again let someone else's neglect determine my own worth. The best part isn't just the trips, isn't just the excitement of planning something for myself, isn't just the thrill of knowing that I have the freedom to create my own joy. The best part is that I don't need anyone to make the day feel important, don't need their recognition to validate my existence, don't need their approval to know that I deserve to be celebrated. Every year, when my birthday comes around, I wake up feeling excited, feeling free, feeling like I've stepped into a version of myself that no longer seeks what she once longed for. I think back to that younger version of me, the girl who sat alone in her room with a gas station cupcake, the girl who stayed up late waiting for footsteps in the hallway, The girl who tried to convince herself over and over again that it didn't matter, that she was fine, that she didn't need what everyone else seemed to have so easily. And I wish I could reach back in time and tell her what I know now, that she wasn't asking for too much, that she was worth celebrating, that she would one day learn how to give herself everything she had ever needed. Now, when people ask me what I'm doing for my birthday, I smile because I already know the answer. I'll be somewhere beautiful, somewhere I've always wanted to go, somewhere that reminds me that life is too short to wait for other people to make you feel like you matter. Because the truth is, I have already given myself the best gift of all, the knowledge that I never have to wait for anyone to remember me ever again.